Among our visitors today, Tim and Joe Cook are back with us. Marty has returned and brought a friend, Isaiah Miller. I'm just happy to know Marty has a friend. Beth and the girls are doing well, I understand. And I tell him every time I see him, I want to see Beth and the girls, not Marty. But it's Marty that keeps showing up. But we're glad to have Marty here as well, and Isaiah. If you're just joining us for the first time in this class, we have for this quarter been looking at world geography and ancient history. What we've covered thus far are Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and today Iran. In the first slide that you see behind me is a representation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2. I believe that this book was written during the post-exilic period, or perhaps even in the exile itself. Daniel and his friends were uprooted from Judah by the Babylonians and taken back to Babylon. Jeremiah had predicted a 70-year captivity. Isaiah had predicted at the end of that 70 years that a king by the name of Cyrus would rise up and defeat the Babylonians and allow the captives to return to their homeland. If indeed this was written during the exile or the post-exilic period, it means that it was written approximately 450 years before some of the events that played out occurred. Liberal scholars would argue that Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC, and so some of the things described there are actually events that have already occurred, but still he makes predictions that are at least 200 years down the road. And I know, as well as you do, that we really can't predict what's going to happen next week. So 200 years or 450 years, there's only one way to explain this, and that's the hand of God. Nebuchadnezzar's dream was of an image depicted here artistically for you. He demanded that someone tell him what he had dreamed and what all of that meant. And of course, Daniel was the only one who could do that. And what his dream actually did was depict history for the next 5 centuries. He begins by acknowledging that Nebuchadnezzar was the head of the image, and that the chest would be the Medo-Persian Empire, that the legs of iron represented the Roman Empire, and the feet, various kingdoms that would come thereafter. And what we know historically is that this is exactly how history played out in the Middle East. The Babylonians fell at the hands of the Medo-Persians, modern Iran. The Medo-Persians were defeated by Alexander the Great. Alexander was the son of Philip of Macedon. And Alexander's kingdom, and we will note this in the course of our study, at his death divided among 4 generals. And ultimately, his empire fell to the Romans. And the conclusion of Daniel 2:44 was, in the days of these kings, meaning the Romans, God would set up a kingdom that would break apart and consume all other kingdoms, and of it there would be no end. And what we have learned is that God is indeed involved in history. We see his handiwork as we look at Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, and now the Medo-Persian Empire, and how he will use this empire to continue to perpetuate the nation of Israel, so that ultimately he could send his son into this world as the Redeemer and through Abraham's seed, singular, Jesus, the whole world would be blessed. So when you talk about the Medo-Persian Empire of the Old Testament, you're talking about modern Iran. And I may have mentioned last week that a cleric in Saudi Arabia actually made light of the Iranians, saying that they were not even true Muslims, that they traced their roots back to Zoroaster, and therefore are not true Muslims in the sense that Muslims in Saudi Arabia and most of the world are. We learned when we dealt with Saudi Arabia that that desert nation was where Islam developed, and Saudi Arabia holds the two major holy places in Islam's history, Mecca and Medina. And they are Sunni Muslims. Iran is primarily Shia Muslims. And the Shia and the Sunni do not get along. And with the exception of the first maybe 40 years after the death of Muhammad, that has been the case. Many of the problems in that part of the world are directly tied to the Sunni-Shia split and the Shia hatred for Israel, and Israel and the Palestinian hatred of one another. And I will tell you up front, and I think we made mention of this at the start of our study, there is really very little that is going to bring about peace over there until these people learn to respect each other and differing views and stop sowing the seeds of hatred. And I think if you watch the news or read the papers, it's clear that the Sunni and the Shia are not likely to do that anytime soon. Saudi Arabia's greatest enemy is not Israel, it's Iran. Iran has sided with Syria, and Syria and Iran have saddled up next to Russia, and therefore that war over there is not close to being ended. They tried a peace of sorts that didn't work at all, and it's not going to work as long as these folks have the kind of hatred they have. As you can see, Iran has Iraq to the west, Turkey to the northwest, the Armenians and Azerbaijan are directly north, as are Turkmenistan, and then to the east, Afghanistan. You know what's going on over there. And of course, south of Afghanistan is Pakistan, and this is just a hotbed for war, death, and destruction. Interestingly, for a long time, the Iranians seem to be the people with the closest ties to the United States up until the Shah was forced to leave and things imploded. But I just read this past week that you can visit Iran as a tourist for just under $6,000, two people, including flights. And the author of the article said, and by the way, alcohol is pretty much available everywhere. It's just under the table. And if you talk to the average person, they're delighted to see you as an American because they don't get to talk to Americans. I called my travel agent. I can't wait to go. Yeah, right. But that's the situation. There is an undercurrent in Iran that opposes the religious mullahs who are in charge of this nation. And I don't know when, but I have no doubt that at some point they're going to rise up and put a stop to the ultra-conservative movement in this nation. It's very similar to movements that have occurred in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the undercurrents in the civil war in Syria, leading to the caliphate and the development of ISIS. So you have a picture here of where the Medo-Persian Empire was in relationship to modern history. This particular slide gives you some idea of the geography of the land, and you notice there are mountains to the north that provide great protection to the Iranians. There are mountains to the southwest that provide similar protection. A great deal of desert that is essentially worthless were it not for all the oil there. And so the Iranians, to have influence, really need to either go east or west. And they're trying to do that, trying to exert greater influence to their neighbors to the west, including Syria, and their neighbors to the east, in particular the Taliban and Afghanistan. This is a breakdown of the citizens of Iran, and as you can see, there are a great number of ethnicities in this region. The really dark little checkers that you see on the map behind me, they represent Shiite Muslims. And of course, the Shia predominate Iran. But there are elements of the Sunnis, as well as in the north, the Kurds and a number of other lesser minorities. What happens when you get all of these basic ethnicities involved? You get clashes. And they have been, throughout much of their history, a nation dealing with these different ethnic groups and the confrontations that inevitably occur. What is happening in America today, and this is just an aside, is, in my judgment, something characteristic of what you see in this region right now. Different groups of people aligned with those who share their same culture, faith, and DNA, in opposition to everybody else. In America, for most of our history, people saw America as a melting pot. They came here and they wanted to blend in. They learned English as quickly as they could. They adopted American customs and tried to be American. And that was a great benefit. What we see right now is a different approach. People are coming here from other parts of the world, and they're settling in certain geographic places and trying to maintain their culture, their customs, their language while being in America. And I have no problem with people wanting to come here. In fact, if I didn't live here, this is where I would want to be. But I would want to be American. Because we are so politically correct, we're not urging people to learn English. We're not encouraging them to be part of the great melting pot and to assimilate in culture. And it's leading to real problems in places like Dearborn, Michigan, even sections of Columbus that have large Somali populations, and there are others. And it has nothing to do with anyone's skin color or their origin in any part of the world. It's simply a matter of learning to assimilate. And because we are a politically correct nation now, we're no longer encouraging that. Don't you get tired of going to the store and everything is in English and Spanish? If you want to live here and come from Mexico, learn English. It will do you a great deal of good and no harm. But what are we seeing? That's not the attitude that people are bringing. And by the way, I plan to have lunch at Las Troncas. And I always ask for Jorge, and they're wonderful people. But there really needs to be some assimilation. If that had occurred in this region of the world, the Kurds and their neighbors, the Turks and the Iraqis, would be getting along better. But that's not what has happened, and in all probability, not likely to happen. And though I'm not a prophet nor the son of a prophet, folks, if things don't turn around here, this is where we're headed. with more and more people coming in, refusing to assimilate, and really dictating to us as guests how they should live and be treated, and what language they should speak and what customs they should continue. If you want to stay what you were, where you were before you came here, why don't you just stay there? And I don't think that's being unkind, unchristian, unbiblical. In the first century, average people spoke Aramaic in Palestine, Greek, and Hebrew. Well, I'm not opposed to being multilingual. In fact, I think that's a good thing. But you need to know the language of the people where you live and not insist that those people adapt to you. You end up with something like this, if that's the case. And I may be stretching the point for some of you, I don't know, but I'm just telling you that we have got to get away from our political correctness in this country and get back to the Constitution and the kind of nation we once knew that brought people in and they just melted among us. And that's the way it ought to be. The Persian Empire had 3 glory days. You can see them here depicted on the map. As you do, the very dark reddish orange is the 16th century A.D. Persian Empire, completely Muslim. The slightly larger gold, that's the empire in about 670 A.D. And then the lighter gold that is much larger, that's the empire in the days of Daniel. The influence of the Medo-Persians was at its greatest at the time that Daniel and his friends were uprooted, resettled in Babylon, and then conquered by the Medes and Persians. Now, we've been talking a lot about the Sunnis and the Shias, and I thought this map would help you appreciate the fact that the Shia in Iran are clearly in the minority. Most Muslims today are Sunni. And as you know, in Saudi Arabia, the heart of Sunni Islam, Wahhabism, is the dominant belief. Sharia law, the Saudi Arabian kings, the House of Saud, made a deal with the Mullah Wahhabi. If you will support our kingdom, we will support your particular brand of Islam and your radical preaching and teaching financially. And that agreement, though made 2 centuries ago essentially, is still ongoing. And so the Saudi Arabias, from all the oil money that has come in, has financed this movement among Sunni Muslims who have their roots in Wahhabism to build mosques and madrasas, that's schools where their brand of Islam is advocated all over the world. And these are the folks that flew the planes into the towers in New York, the Pentagon, and crashed in Pennsylvania. They were directly tied to Wahhabism. Most of them were Saudi Arabians, and all of the money that we have sent over there to purchase their oil has financed this rise among this very radical Muslim movement. And so, in a sense, we financed our own attack. But Saudi Arabia has been an ally of the U.S. For a long time, and Iran was until 1979. And then everything just twisted. But as you can see, there are pockets of Shia outside of Iran, in Syria, in Yemen, and in Afghanistan. But most of the rest of Islam in Africa, in Europe, in Indonesia is Sunni, not Shia. And the Sunni and the Shia don't like each other at all. Now let's talk a little bit about this region of the world in relationship to Scripture. The Medo-Persian Empire defeated the Babylonians. The king who had the dream with the image that you saw at the outset of this morning's study was the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. He was not defeated. It was, in fact, during the days of Nabonidus that the kingdom fell, Daniel chapter 5. Nabonidus was technically not the king at that time. His son was ruling. Nabonidus had taken a hiatus. He had left and put his son in charge, and Belshazzar was the man in charge when the Medo-Persians actually conquered Babylon, Daniel 5. It was under the Medo-Persian kings that Daniel spent his night in the lion's den. One of the things we've noted, and we'll no doubt note here shortly again, is that the Persians had a different philosophy about war and victory than did the Assyrians or the Babylonians. The Assyrians were probably the most cruel, vile, wicked folk to ever wage war. And they bragged about how they treated their enemies. And it was on a scale far grander than anything we've seen in recent times in this part of the world. If you think the beheading of somebody is bad, and it is, I grant you, but they did it to thousands and thousands and thousands and piled their skulls and talked about the mountains they made out of human skulls, just as an example. But they fell to the Babylonians. The Babylonians were cruel, but not as cruel. It was the Babylonians who defeated Judah. Remember, the Assyrians defeated the nation to the north, Israel, and the Babylonians defeated the Assyrians and then marched to Jerusalem, 606, 597, and then in 586 they leveled the city, destroyed the walls, destroyed the temple, and anybody left who had any skills at all was returned to Babylon. And the captivity is dated from 606 to 536. That's 70 years, as the prophet Jeremiah had predicted. And Cyrus came on the scene, and just as Isaiah had predicted, sent the captives who wanted to return back home, including, as we will note shortly, men like Ezra, Nehemiah, and Zerubbabel. But Daniel was in the lion's den under the Medo-Persian Empire, not the Babylonian. Cyrus, as I said, did send the captives back who wanted to go. The prophecy about Cyrus is found in Isaiah 36 and again in 44 and 45. And the fulfillment of that, Ezra chapter 1, 1 through 8. Ezra gives the historical background for the return of the captives. Thus, the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, and Zechariah play important roles in the return. The prophets Haggai and Zechariah have the role of urging the people to finish their task. They came back in 536, and one of the first things they did was lay the foundation for the new temple. And Ezra records that. He tells us that the young people rejoiced and the old people cried. And the rejoicing and the crying were so loud on both sides that it was hard to distinguish which was which. And the reason the young people rejoiced is they were back home and the foundations of a new temple had just been laid, and that was positive. The old people wept because the new temple would be nothing like Solomon's temple. It would not in any sense be on a similar scale, and it brought tears to their eyes. Well, laying the foundations in 536, they quit work. They stopped and started focusing on their own homes, They were called paneled homes or sealed homes in the King James. And all these efforts to take care of themselves, to build nice homes and to plant gardens and vineyards and reap crops, they just could not get ahead. And the prophet said it's like putting money into a bag that has a hole. It keeps falling out. And folks, it's not going to get any better until you do the job you came back to do, and that's finish the temple. So in 520, in August of 520, Haggai begins to preach, urging the people to do the job they came back to do. And his book goes from August to December, and his work with that of Zechariah got the temple ultimately completed. This was all under the Medo-Persian Empire, and in fact, they received some help from the empire itself. Now, Nehemiah is about returning to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. He was cupbearer to the king, and the king saw him sad and had never seen him that way before, and immediately asked, "What's going on?" And Nehemiah explained that he had learned from his brother the terrible state of things back in Jerusalem. The walls were decrepit, there was no safety, and the king agreed that Nehemiah could return and rebuild the walls, and that the king himself would finance it. And that's what you have, at least in the first several chapters of Nehemiah. And again, this is all under the Persians, whose philosophy was those folks who had been uprooted were now free to go back to their homeland, and rather than discouraging worship, the Persians encouraged people to return to their former ways. And so that's what happened: Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, and Zechariah. This is also the period when the story of Esther unfolds. The king was married to a queen who didn't listen the way the king thought she should. He's having a big party, as you know. He summons Vashti to come essentially and be put on parade because she was a very beautiful woman, and she refused. And the people who were the closest advisors to the king said, if it gets out that the queen doesn't listen to the king, we're all sunk. So you got to get rid of her. And that's how the story of Esther unfolds. And she, as a result, is able to deliver her people from certain destruction at the hand of Haman. So that story is also from this empire. This kingdom fell to Alexander the Great in 330 BC. Alexander was the son, as we've said, of Philip of Macedon, and he came to the throne at the age of 20. By the age of 33, he conquered his world and ultimately died of malaria. So modern Iran was ancient Persia. Ancient Persia fell to the empire of Alexander. Alexander was a Greek, a Macedonian Greek. In the first century, Greece was divided between Macedonia to the north and Achaia to the south. The main cities of Macedonia were Thessalonica, Berea, and Laodicea. And the main cities to the south were Athens and Corinth. But we'll get to those at a later time. Now, modern Iran is ruled by the Ayatollah Khomeini first, and then his successor now, Ali Khamenei. There was another gentleman that should have come to leadership within Shia Islam in Iran, but he was too moderate, and so Khomeini wrote a letter to their, well, it would be the equivalent of the British Parliament or our legislatures, and changed the rules so that this man, Ali Khamenei, who was much similar to his predecessor, could be in charge. They were afraid that somebody with moderate views might come to a position of leadership, and they weren't going to allow that. Now, from what we have learned already, in 1948 or so, elections resulted in the selection by the Iranians of a leader. They didn't call him president. I don't remember the exact term that they used, but it would be the equivalent of president here. But he had Marxist leanings. And the British, in particular, didn't like that because they had the oil in this part of the world. Remember the end of World War I, the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, the divisions of the geography over here we called lines in the sand, and how without regard to ethnicity, they just drew lines in the sand and didn't think about, ethnic considerations. And so you got what I showed you a while ago in Iran with all of these different groups. The British encouraged the Americans to do something about it. And so the CIA got involved, and in 1952, with the assistance of the CIA, there was a coup to overthrow the duly elected ruler of Iran. Now, you can imagine how that would have gone over with those folks. I would like to tell you, in our history, we've always been above board, and everything we've done has been right. But I know too much history to say something as ludicrous as that. Right now, if you're following it, the leader of the Philippines is trying to cut ties with the U.S. There's a lot more behind that than you probably know unless you have done some reading about our relationship with the Philippines going back to the beginning of the last century. And frankly, they were not even treated as human beings by the United States at one point in our dealings with them. So there has, in spite of the promises of Doug MacArthur to return, there has been some bad blood for a long time, and it's really starting to surface again. But that has nothing to do with world geography and biblical history. It's just, I thought you needed to be aware of that. So the CIA-inspired coup in 1952 still leaves a bad taste in the mouths of many Iranians. In 1979, as a result of the coup, a Shah comes to power. And the Shah is a close ally of the U.S. In fact, we trained his military, we provided them with all kinds of equipment, but he wasn't well loved by his people. And so there was a revolution in 1979 in which the Shah was overthrown. That's when the hostages were taken. You have to be of a certain age to remember that, but if you go back to the days of, say, Reagan, you know the background, the hostages in Iran, and what brought about their freedom. You know that under Carter, there was an effort to rescue them. It failed miserably, and I don't blame Carter for that. It's just that part of the world with the weather conditions and the geography, the sand and the wind and the heat and all of that, they had problems with equipment, and it was just a fiasco. Well, under Reagan, the hostages finally came home, and the Ayatollah Khomeini came to power. He is obviously a Shia Muslim with very hardcore beliefs, and right now it is the mullahs that call the shots in Iran. They have a government, but the government and everything the government does is under control of the religious leadership, and they can, quite frankly, do whatever they want, and the government has no choice but to go along with it. And that, as you can imagine, leads to some serious issues. We've been hearing a lot about them of late because of their nuclear program. They're wanting a bomb, and the United States recently signed an agreement that supposedly will keep them from getting a bomb for at least 10 years, and I don't know why 10 years from now it'll be okay. I'm still trying to figure this one out. We recently returned to them millions and millions of dollars that were frozen in Iranian assets following the ouster of the Shah. That money, at least in part, will go to finance more terrorism and to aid in the civil war in Syria, of which Iranians are co-sponsors with the Russians. I don't know what to tell you about this other than I'm just, some 65-year-old know-nothing, but I have struggled to understand why in the world we make a deal like that as a government. I see nothing beneficial to this nation and everything beneficial to the Iranians, but that's the way it played out, and I'll just move on. As I said, they're the leading sponsor of terror in the world today, and they call for the destruction of Israel and refer to America as the Great Satan. Now, keep in mind that our own leaders are telling us over and over again that Islam is a religion of peace. And there are so many wonderfully good things inherent in that religion. But Islam, Sunni or Shia, has no use for Israel. The Saudi Arabians have made nice with Israel only because they need an ally against the Iranians. They hate the Iranians even more than they hate the Israelis. But the Iranians have called for the complete destruction of Israel. And one of the reasons they want nuclear weapons is to accomplish that goal, in my judgment. I haven't talked to the Khomeini. I don't know the mullahs personally, but just by reading, it's clear that their ultimate goal is the destruction of Israel and the conquest of the world. The caliphate, ISIS, the civil war in Syria, that's all, they argue, the beginning of Allah's plan for Islam to conquer the world. And when they conquer the world, here are the choices. You convert or you die. And that's their attitude. And if you think that's a good thing, I'm at a loss to understand that. And yet, our president, and at least one of our presidential candidates, won't even refer to radical Islam. And how do you fight an enemy that you won't even acknowledge? And I'm not in any way implying to you that we need to mistreat anybody. We're Christians. We treat everybody the way we would want to be treated. And it doesn't matter how they dress, the color of their skin, or any of the externals that seem to matter with the world. It shouldn't matter to us. But at the same time, let's not stick our heads in the sand and fail to recognize that there's a real threat. And it will have to be addressed. The president at this time is Hassan Rouhani, and the present supreme leader who overrules the president, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, not to be confused with the original Ayatollah Khomeini. This is Khomeini's successor. That's what we're dealing with when we talk about Iran and ancient history. We're talking about the Medo-Persian Empire. You look at the relationship that developed in that part of the world among the various factions. They've been at each other's throats throughout all of history. Do you see that changing anytime soon? I don't. This region of the world, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Palestine, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and we're going to talk about those other places too. There's just been this constant turmoil, fighting, hatred, and even within Palestine itself, the nation of Israel. Israelis grow up hating Palestinians, and Palestinians grow up being taught to hate Israelis. And as long as that kind of philosophy is nurtured on each side, you can't find an agreement that will solve it. You can meet at Camp David all you want, But meetings at Camp David will not change hearts in Palestine. And that's what's going to be required for that to ever get any better. Nobody seems to want to admit that, but it's still true. Next Sunday, we pick up our study, and we'll be looking at Syria. Now, Syria is north of Israel and west of Iraq. And it is the center of the caliphate, though the caliphate, as you know, is under attack at this point. They're making an effort to retake Mosul in the north of Iraq, a major oil exporting region, but the caliphate had control of a large section of Syria and a fair amount of Iraq. But it's now starting to compact, and I just read Friday that the leaders in ISIS are now saying, and they're adept at their publicity, that this is just God's plan. God's wanting us to coalesce, come together. It's not about territory, it's about winning hearts. And don't get concerned if it looks like we're being defeated, because we're not. Allah's still in charge. Sure He is. I believe God is in charge. But I can't find anything to suggest that God would sanction the kind of things that have characterized Islam throughout its entire history.